On my 70th birthday, my son's wife raised a toast to the old lady who's off to the nursing home soon. Even my son laughed. 2 days later, their home loan was canceled. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. Chapter 1: The Humiliation. I never imagined that my 70th birthday would be the day I finally understood how little my own family thought of me. The dining room was decorated with balloons and flowers, the table set with my grandmother's china, and everyone I loved was gathered around me. It should have been perfect. Marcus had driven down from Portland with Skylar, and seeing my son walk through the door still made my heart flutter with joy the way it had when he was 5 years old coming home from school. At 42, he still had that same crooked smile, though now it was framed by the beginning of gray at his temples. "Happy birthday, Mom," he said, wrapping me in a hug that felt genuine. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe this would be different from other family gatherings. Skylar followed behind him, her blonde hair perfectly styled, wearing a dress that probably cost more than most people's rent. She'd been my daughter-in-law for 8 years now, and I'd tried so hard to love her, to make her feel welcome in our family. She gave me a tight smile and a quick hug that felt more like an obligation. "Ava, you look wonderful," she said, though her eyes were already scanning the room, probably calculating the value of my antiques. We sat down to dinner, and I felt that familiar warmth spreading through my chest as I looked around the table. My younger sister Helen had come with her husband, and my neighbor Mrs. Chun had joined us too. Everyone was talking and laughing, and for the first hour I felt genuinely happy. Then came time for the toasts. Marcus stood up first, raising his wine glass. "To my incredible mother, who has always been there for us, who taught me everything I know about hard work and dedication." I felt tears prick my eyes. This was what I'd hoped for. Helen spoke next, sharing a funny story from our childhood that had everyone chuckling. Then Mrs. Chun said a few kind words about what a good neighbor I'd been over the years. But then Skylar stood up. She swayed slightly, having had more wine than usual, and raised her glass with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The room fell quiet, waiting for her words. "Well," she began, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she thought she was being clever, "I think we should all toast to Ava, the woman who's lived such a full life and who will soon be moving on to her next adventure." I felt my stomach tighten. Something in her voice made me nervous. "Here's to the old lady who'll soon be heading off to the nursing home where she belongs," Skylar declared with a bright laugh, as if she'd just made the most delightful joke. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt the blood drain from my face as the words hit me like a physical blow. Mrs. Chun gasped audibly. Helen's mouth fell open. But what broke my heart completely was the sound that came next. Marcus laughing. Not a shocked, uncomfortable laugh. Not a nervous giggle. A real genuine laugh, as if what his wife had just said was actually funny. "Skylar," he chuckled, shaking his head but still smiling, "you're terrible." The room remained frozen. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting to see how I would react. My hands were shaking as I set down my water glass. "I think," I said quietly, my voice somehow steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest, "I think I need some fresh air." I stood up carefully, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. As I walked toward the kitchen door that led to my garden, I heard Skylar's voice behind me, still tinged with that awful false sweetness. "Oh, come on, Ava. It was just a joke. Don't be so sensitive." I stepped outside into the cool evening air and finally allowed myself to breathe. 70 years old, and this was how my own family saw me. Not as a woman who had worked 2 jobs to put Marcus through college. Not as someone who had helped them with the down payment on their first house. Not as a mother and grandmother who still had so much to give. I was just an old lady who belonged in a nursing home. Standing there in my garden, surrounded by the roses I'd planted and tended for 30 years, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt was still there, sharp and deep, but underneath it, something harder was taking shape. If they thought I was just a helpless old woman, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. 2 days after my birthday, I was sitting in my kitchen with my morning coffee when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Marcus's name, and for a split second, I hoped he was calling to apologize. That hope died the moment I heard his voice. "Mom, we have a problem," he said, his words rushed and panicked. "The bank called this morning. They're pulling our financing for the house. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch between us. The house he was referring to was a 4-bedroom colonial in an upscale neighborhood, the kind of place Skylar had been dreaming about since they got married. They'd been planning to move in next month. "Oh my," I said calmly. "That's unfortunate." "Unfortunate." Marcus's voice cracked slightly. "Mom, we've already put down the earnest money. We've ordered furniture. Skylar has been planning this move for months. The bank said something about a change in our financial backing, but I don't understand what that means." I did understand perfectly. What it meant was that 48 hours ago, I had walked into Cascade National Bank and had a very polite conversation with Mr. Rodriguez, the loan officer who had been handling Marcus's mortgage application. "Mrs. Harrison," he had said, looking confused as he pulled up the file on his computer, "are you sure you want to remove yourself as the co-signer? Your son's application was approved specifically because of your involvement." "I'm quite sure," I had replied, signing the necessary paperwork with a steady hand. Now, listening to my son's panicked breathing on the other end of the line, I felt a small flicker of something that might have been satisfaction. "Marcus," I said gently, "perhaps you should speak with your bank about what options you have." "We already did that," he said, frustration creeping into his voice. "They said without the co-signer, our debt-to-income ratio is too high." "Mom, I don't even know who the co-signer was. The bank won't tell us because of privacy laws." I almost smiled at that. Of course they wouldn't tell him. I had specifically requested that my involvement be kept confidential. Marcus had always been so proud, so determined to make it on his own. I hadn't wanted to hurt his ego by letting him know that his success had been built on his mother's financial backing. "Have you considered that maybe this house is simply beyond your means?" I asked. There was a long pause. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was tight with stress. "Mom, we can afford the payments. We've been pre-approved for months. Something changed and I need to figure out what." In the background, I could hear Skylar's voice high and shrill. "Tell her we need help, Marcus. She's family, she has to help us." My grip tightened on the phone. "Has to help us." As if everything I had done for them over the years had been an obligation rather than love. "Marcus," I said, "I'm sure you'll figure something out. You're a smart man." "But Mom." "I have to go, dear. I'm meeting Helen for lunch." That was a lie. I wasn't meeting anyone for lunch. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the framed photos on my refrigerator. Marcus at his college graduation. Marcus and Skylar's wedding. Pictures of a family that I had thought loved me. The phone rang 3 more times that afternoon. I didn't answer. That evening my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and saw Marcus and Skylar standing on my porch. Marcus looked haggard, his hair disheveled. Skylar stood behind him, her arms crossed, her face set in hard lines. I opened the door but didn't invite them in. "Mom," Marcus said immediately, "we need to talk." "About what, dear?" "About the house. About what happened with our financing." His eyes searched my face. "Do you know anything about this?" I looked at him for a long moment, this son I had raised and loved and sacrificed for. Then I looked at Skylar, standing behind him with that entitled expression she wore so often. "I know," I said quietly, "that sometimes life has a way of teaching us lessons we didn't expect to learn." Marcus frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Instead of answering, I smiled at them both. "Would you like some coffee? We have so much to discuss." I led them into my living room, where they sat on the edge of my sofa like children called to the principal's office. Marcus kept running his hands through his hair, a nervous habit he'd had since he was 12. Skylar sat rigid beside him, her designer purse clutched in her lap like armor. "Mom," Marcus began, "I need you to be straight with me. Do you know why our financing fell through?" I settled into my favorite armchair, the one that had been my mother's, and folded my hands in my lap. "Marcus, how long have you been living in your current house?" He blinked, clearly not expecting the question. 5 years. "You know that. And who helped you with the down payment?" We managed it ourselves," he said, though uncertainty flickered across his face. Skylar leaned forward impatiently. "What does this have to do with anything? We need to know about the new house." I ignored her and continued looking at my son. Do you remember when you bought your car? The BMW. Of course I remember. I got a great deal on the financing. Because you had an excellent co-signer, I said gently. The color slowly drained from Marcus's face. Mom, what are you saying? I stood up and walked to my antique secretary desk, the one that had belonged to my grandmother. From the bottom drawer, I pulled out a thick manila folder. It was one of several I kept there, all meticulously organized and labeled. I'm saying, I replied, returning to my chair with the folder, that you've never been as independent as you thought you were. I opened the folder and spread the contents across my coffee table. Bank statements, loan documents, property deeds, investment portfolios. Marcus's eyes widened as he recognized his name on document after document. The house you're living in now, I said, pointing to a deed. I co-signed for that mortgage. Your car loan, I guaranteed that too. The business loan you took out 3 years ago to expand your consulting practice? That was only approved because I provided collateral. Marcus stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language. But I never asked you to do any of this. No, you didn't ask. You've always been so proud, so determined to make it on your own. I didn't want to hurt your feelings by telling you that your success needed my help. Skylar snatched up one of the bank statements, her eyes scanning the numbers. This says you have over $800,000 in savings. How is that possible? You live so modestly. I almost laughed at her shocked expression. Skylar, I've been working and saving for 50 years. I bought this house when it cost $30,000. I invested in Microsoft when it was $5 a share. Just because I don't feel the need to show off my wealth doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Marcus was still staring at the mortgage documents. Mom, if you co-signed for everything, then you could. I could call in any of these loans at any time. I finished for him. Yes, Marcus, I could. And 2 days ago, I removed myself as the co-signer for your new house. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the wheels turning in both their heads as they began to understand the scope of what I was telling them. Why? Marcus whispered. Why would you do that? I leaned back in my chair and studied their faces. My son looked genuinely confused and hurt. Skylar looked calculating, like she was trying to figure out how to turn this information to her advantage. Do you remember what happened at my birthday dinner? I asked quietly. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Skylar was just joking around. She didn't mean anything by it. She called me an old lady who belongs in a nursing home, I said, my voice steady. And you laughed. Mom, it was just what, Marcus? Just a joke? Just harmless fun at my expense. I gathered the papers back into their folder. For 8 years, I've watched Skylar treat me like an inconvenience. I've listened to her complain about having to visit me, about how my house smells like old people, about how I dress too plainly for family photos. And I've watched you say nothing. Skylar's face flushed red. I never said any of those things. I looked at her directly for the first time since they'd arrived. You said them to your sister on the phone last Christmas. You were in my kitchen and you thought I was in the garden. You said you couldn't wait for me to die so Marcus could inherit everything, and you could finally live the life you deserved. The color drained from Skylar's face completely. Marcus turned to stare at his wife with an expression I'd never seen before. You said what? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. That's not. You misunderstood, Skylar stammered. I stood up, the folder clutched in my hands. I think it's time for you both to leave. You have some things to discuss. As they walked toward the door, Marcus turned back. Mom, can we fix this? Can we work this out? I looked at my son, this man I had raised and loved and protected his entire life, and felt something crack inside my chest. That depends, I said softly, on whether you're ready to see me as something more than just your backup plan. For 3 weeks after that confrontation, my phone was silent. No calls from Marcus, no surprise visits, no text messages asking how I was doing. The quiet should have bothered me, but instead I found it oddly peaceful. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone to need something from me. I spent my days tending to my garden, reading the books I'd been meaning to get to, and having long lunches with Helen and Mrs. Chun. It was during one of these lunches that Helen asked the question I'd been dreading. Have you heard from Marcus lately? I set down my teacup carefully. No, not recently. Helen studied my face with the sharp eyes of someone who'd known me for 70 years. Ava, what did you do? I told her everything. About the birthday dinner, about Skylar's cruel toast, about Marcus's laughter. About the financing I'd withdrawn and the conversation that followed. Helen listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and shook her head. Good for you. Good for me. Ava, I've been watching that girl walk all over you for years. And Marcus. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Marcus has gotten comfortable taking you for granted. 2 days later, I was watering my tomato plants when I heard raised voices coming from the house next door. The Hendersons had moved out last month, and the house had been sitting empty. But now there was a moving truck in the driveway and people carrying boxes. I was surprised to recognize one of the voices as Marcus's. He was arguing with someone on the phone, pacing back and forth on the porch while movers carried furniture past him. No, we can't afford that, he was saying, his voice tight with stress. We've already downsized as much as we can. Downsized. I watched as the movers brought out furniture I recognized from their old house. The expensive leather sectional Skylar had insisted on buying. The dining room set that cost more than most people's cars. They were moving into a rental house half the size of their previous home. That evening, Mrs. Chun knocked on my door with a casserole and the latest neighborhood gossip. Did you see who moved in next door? She asked, settling into my kitchen chair like she'd done 100 times before. I saw the moving truck. It's your son and his wife. Mrs. Henderson told me they're renting month to month. She paused, giving me a meaningful look. Word is they lost their house. Financial trouble. I absorbed this information silently, though my chest felt tight. Part of me wanted to march over there and fix everything the way I always had. But a larger part of me remained firmly seated at my kitchen table. Mrs. Chun, I said carefully, what do you think of people who help their children too much? She considered this seriously. In China we have a saying, give a man a fish, feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, feed him for life. But there's another part people forget. If you keep giving him fish, he never learns to use the fishing rod. Over the following days I couldn't help but notice the changes next door. Skylar's BMW disappeared, replaced by a 10-year-old Honda. The expensive lawn service stopped coming, and I watched Marcus mowing the small yard himself, looking increasingly frustrated with the old push mower. I was getting my mail one afternoon when Skylar appeared at the end of her driveway. She looked different, tired, older somehow. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she was wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt instead of her usual designer clothes. Hello, Ava, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Skylar. We stood there for a moment in awkward silence. Then she took a step closer. I wanted to apologize, she said, for what I said at your birthday. It was inappropriate and hurtful. I waited, sensing there was more. Marcus and I have been having some difficulties. Financial stress can put a strain on a marriage, you know. There it was. The real reason for the apology. Not genuine remorse, but another attempt to manipulate me into helping them. I'm sorry to hear you're having problems, I said simply. Skylar's mask slipped slightly. Ava, we're family. Surely you can't want to see us struggle like this. I looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had spent 8 years treating me like an inconvenience, who had publicly humiliated me at my own birthday party, who had told her sister she was waiting for me to die. Skylar, I said quietly, family is supposed to be about love and respect, not just financial convenience. I turned and walked back to my house, leaving her standing in the driveway. Through my kitchen window, I watched her return to her new home, her shoulders slumped in defeat. That night, as I sat in my garden with a cup of tea, I heard voices through the thin walls of the rental house. Marcus and Skylar were arguing again, their voices carrying clearly in the still evening air. This is all your fault. Skylar's voice was sharp with anger. If you hadn't laughed at that stupid joke, we'd still have our house. My fault. Marcus shot back. You're the one who insulted my mother at her birthday party. I was just trying to be funny. She's always been too sensitive. Too sensitive? Skylar, you basically told her she was worthless and should be put away. Their voices faded as they moved deeper into the house, but the damage was done. I could hear the cracks forming in their marriage, the stress fractures that happened when a relationship built on money and convenience was stripped of both. I finished my tea and went inside feeling strangely calm. Whatever happened next, I knew I had made the right choice. It was a Thursday morning when Marcus finally knocked on my door. I'd been expecting this visit for weeks, watching him through my kitchen window as he paced his small front yard, clearly working up the courage to face me. When I opened the door, I was shocked by how much he'd changed. His face was drawn, his clothes wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Mom," he said, his voice hoarse, "can we talk?" I stepped aside to let him in, noticing how he moved with the weighted steps of a man carrying too much burden. We sat in my living room, the same chairs where we'd had our confrontation a month ago, but everything felt different now. "Skylar left," he said without preamble. I felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy, but I kept my expression neutral. "I'm sorry to hear that." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Are you? Because I'm starting to think you saw this coming." I folded my hands in my lap. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've been thinking about what you said. About how Skylar treated you, about the things she said." He rubbed his temples. "I started paying attention, really paying attention, and I realized you were right about everything." He pulled out his phone and set it on the coffee table between us. "She called her sister yesterday. I heard the whole conversation through the bathroom door." I waited, sensing he needed to tell me this. "She said she was done playing house with a broke loser, that she'd wasted 8 years of her life on someone who couldn't even keep a roof over her head." His voice cracked slightly. "She said she was going to find someone who could actually take care of her the way she deserved." The pain in my son's voice cut through me, but underneath it I heard something else. Relief. "Marcus," I said gently, "I need to show you something." I went to my desk and retrieved another folder, one I'd hoped I'd never have to open. Inside were printed emails, text message screenshots, and photographs. I'd been collecting them for 2 years, not out of malice, but out of a growing need to protect myself and my son from the truth I was beginning to see. "What is this?" Marcus asked as I spread the contents across the table. "Evidence of who Skylar really is." The first document was a printout of text messages between Skylar and her sister, dated from 6 months after their wedding. In them, Skylar complained about Marcus's pathetic salary and talked about how she was training him to be more ambitious. She referred to me as the old bat and discussed strategies for getting me to pay for things without Marcus knowing. Marcus's face went white as he read. "How did you get these?" "She left her phone on my kitchen counter last Christmas while she was helping with dishes. It kept buzzing, and I glanced at it to see if it was important." I pointed to another document. "This one is an email to a real estate agent from 3 months ago." The email showed Skylar inquiring about expensive homes, telling the agent that her mother-in-law would be helping with financing, and asking about properties well beyond what Marcus could afford. She'd been planning their upgrade without ever discussing it with him. But the most damaging evidence was a series of photos I'd taken with my phone. They showed Skylar at an upscale restaurant with a man I didn't recognize, holding hands across the table, kissing in the parking lot. The timestamps showed they were taken during a week when she told Marcus she was visiting her mother. "This was last month," I said quietly, "the week before my birthday party." Marcus stared at the photos, his hands shaking. "Who is he?" According to her Facebook posts, which she apparently forgot I could see, his name is Richard. He's a real estate developer. Divorced, wealthy, no children. The silence stretched between us as Marcus processed what he was seeing. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed but clear. "You knew," he said. "You knew all of this and you never told me. Would you have believed me if I had?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Probably not. I tried to warn you in small ways. I tried to help you see who she really was. But you were so in love, so determined to make it work." I gathered the papers back into their folder. I thought maybe if I withdrew my financial support, the pressure would force her to show her true colors. And it did. Marcus leaned back in his chair, looking exhausted but somehow lighter. When the money dried up, she didn't even try to work things out. She just gave up on us. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I know this hurts. You know what the strangest part is?" he said. I'm not as devastated as I thought I'd be. These past few weeks, watching her become more and more angry and bitter as our situation got worse, I realized I didn't even like the person she'd become. Or maybe the person she'd always been. We sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Marcus asked the question I'd been dreading. Mom, can you ever forgive me? For laughing at that dinner. For not standing up for you all those years. I reached across and took his hand, feeling how rough it had become from the manual labor he'd been doing to make ends meet. Marcus, you're my son. I love you no matter what. But I need to know that things will be different going forward. They will be, he said firmly. I promise you they will be. That evening, as I watched Marcus pack his belongings into a small U-Haul truck, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. He was moving back to Portland, planning to rebuild his life from scratch. It would be hard, but for the first time in years he'd be doing it honestly. Before he left, he hugged me tightly on my front porch. Thank you, he whispered, for loving me enough to let me fall. As his truck disappeared down the street, I realized that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone you love is the chance to find out who they really are when everything else falls away. 6 months later, I was sitting in my garden on a crisp October morning when my phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and I smiled as I answered. These days his calls brought me joy instead of anxiety. Good morning, Mom. Good morning, sweetheart. How are you? I'm good. Really good, actually. There was something different in his voice, a lightness I hadn't heard in years. I wanted to call and tell you something. I got a promotion at work. After moving back to Portland, Marcus had taken a job with a small environmental consulting firm. It paid less than his previous position, but he'd thrown himself into the work with an enthusiasm I remembered from when he was younger. That's wonderful, Marcus. I'm so proud of you. There's something else, he continued. I met someone. I felt my heart skip a beat, but this time it wasn't from fear. Oh, her name is Sarah. She's a teacher, a widow with 2 kids. Mom, she's nothing like before. She's kind and genuine, and she actually wants to meet you. I'd love to meet her. Would you like to come for Thanksgiving? Sarah's invited us to her house, and she specifically asked if you'd join us. She said any woman who raised such a good man must be pretty special herself. Tears pricked my eyes. I would love that. After we hung up, I sat in my garden for a long time, watching the leaves fall from my maple tree. The past 6 months had been a revelation. Without the constant worry about Marcus and Skylar, without the phone calls asking for money or the guilt about not doing enough, I discovered who I was beyond being a mother and provider. I joined a book club at the library and found myself looking forward to our passionate discussions about literature. I'd started volunteering at the animal shelter, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for. Mrs. Chun and I had taken a cooking class together, learning to make dishes from around the world. Most surprisingly, I'd begun dating again. Harold Thompson, a retired professor I'd met at the book club, had asked me to dinner 3 weeks ago. We'd been to the theater twice since then, and I found myself feeling like a teenager again, nervous and excited about what might develop. The house next door had been rented to a young couple with twin toddlers. Their laughter filled the neighborhood in a way that Skylar's complaints never had. Sometimes I'd see them struggling with groceries and 2 crying children, and I'd offer to help. They accepted gratefully without entitlement, and always found ways to return the kindness. My doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. I opened it to find a delivery man holding a large bouquet of fall flowers. Mrs. Harrison? These are for you. I took the flowers with surprise and opened the card. Dear Mom, thank you for teaching me the difference between love and dependence. Thank you for showing me that sometimes the people who really love us are the ones willing to let us struggle so we can grow. I love you, Marcus. I buried my face in the chrysanthemums and marigolds, breathing in their earthy scent. When I looked up, I saw Harold walking up my front path, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the shy smile that had first caught my attention. I hope I'm not too early, he said. You mentioned you were making that pot roast recipe from cooking class. Perfect timing, I said, and meant it. As we settled in my kitchen, Harold helping me arrange the flowers while I checked on dinner, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed. A year ago, I'd been trapped in a cycle of giving and being taken from, measuring my worth by how much I could provide for others. I'd been so afraid of being alone that I'd accepted being treated as less than I deserved. Now, at 70 years old, I was discovering what it meant to be valued for who I was rather than what I could give. Marcus called me regularly, not because he needed something but because he genuinely wanted to talk to me. Harold brought me flowers and asked about my thoughts on books we'd read together. My neighbors appreciated my help but never demanded it. "Ava," Harold said, settling into his chair with a glass of wine, "you seem particularly happy today." "I am," I said, surprising myself with how true that statement was. "I feel like I'm finally living the life I was meant to live." "And what kind of life is that?" I considered the question seriously. "One where I'm loved for who I am, not what I can provide. One where I can say no without feeling guilty. One where I'm surrounded by people who add joy to my days instead of stress." That evening, after Harold left with promises to call tomorrow, I walked through my house, really looking at it for the first time in months. The family photos on the mantel had been rearranged. Pictures of Marcus and Skylar had been replaced with new ones. Marcus at his new job, me and Harold at the theater, Mrs. Chan and me at our cooking class, the book club gathered around my dining room table. I picked up my favorite photo taken just last week. It showed me in my garden, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a genuine smile, surrounded by the roses I'd tended for 30 years. I looked happy, relaxed, completely myself. At 70 years old, I'd learned the most important lesson of my life: that being alone was far better than being with people who didn't value you, and that it's never too late to start over. Skylar had been wrong about one thing at my birthday party. I wasn't headed to a nursing home to waste away. I was headed toward the best years of my life.